Media preservation isn't a new issue. In some way or another, it's essential to the study of history. As a concept and field of debate, there's no medium in which reclaiming and maintaining the past is not a concern. In this episode of Pop Politics, we discuss some of the history, challenges, and stories of media preservation and unpack why it matters. I'm Damien Lewarden.
I'm Rebecca Hills-Duty.
I'm Amy Campbell.
And I'm Mitchell Ackhurst.
And together we are Third Take. Very briefly, as I just mentioned, media preservation isn't a new issue. It's something that has been a part of the worldwide landscape for thousands of years, going back to the burning and decline of the Great Library of Alexandria, and then it follows through with the destruction of knowledge throughout the Dark Ages, and then going back to what Mitchell and I were talking about last week with the Nazis, book burning and all that sort of thing. But yeah, it's taken on a bit of a different tenor more recently. So I thought we'd start by just talking about some of the structural challenges to media preservation today. Rebecca, you were really keen to discuss this topic, so I thought we'd start with you.
So, usually if we're talking about preserving media, it's talking about preserving physical media. We're going back to things like the destruction of much of the Doctor Who archives during the 70s, and the loss of things like Dad's Army and all of this sort of stuff. And that's now, in retrospect, seen as a bad thing, because there's all of this stuff which was archetypal and representative of the era. Poof, gone. Because of it, issues involving space, involving budget, involving the volatility of the media itself. For those that don't know, celluloid film had a habit of spontaneously combusting. These days, it's a different problem in that nearly everything is stored digitally. And if you no longer have access to a digital service, that media is gone. So then we look at things like the ending of online services, things like blip.tv with all the thousands and thousands and thousands of videos that were on that. When that service shut down, all of those were gone. And unless the creators actually took the time to either back up those videos or download them off the service, those are gone.
Yeah, I do want to come back to those topics, but Amy, you mentioned something before we sat down to record this about content gating in games, with a particular look to Destiny 2.
Yeah. I think it's such a fascinating thing, because one thing that springs to mind when you were speaking, Rebecca, is the fact that a lot of the reasons we've lost media in the past has been a limitation of some kind, whether it be the fact that the medium itself had the capacity to literally explode, or just by the pure fact that paper can burn. Whereas often in these cases now, it's a choice. There is a choice being made by someone somewhere that is determining whether or not something is or isn't available. And particularly in the context of online gaming platforms, because we are now more than ever in a space and a time where games go on forever, at what point do things have to get locked away? And the biggest struggle with that is my experience of it coming into it new is completely different. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but you then miss a lot of context. And I've been thinking about that a lot with Destiny 2 as someone that's just gotten into it, and was even watching the vid doc that they posted earlier today. And they're like, oh, we're throwing in hints from like Destiny 1 are paying off. And I'm like, this is great. And I'm really stoked for those people that this really matters to. And I think that new weapon type sounds cool. But also, none of that story or context makes any sense to me. And it's clearly a limitation. They've always worked heavily with Xbox as a console and things like that. So console storage capacity and all sorts of things have to come into the mix here about when they say the game's too big, we need something to go. But who makes that call? How is that okay? Is it bad? I don't have an answer to that, but I think about it all the time.
There's a similar situation in two MMOs that I'm aware of. First of all, the Phantasy Star Online 2, which up until last year wasn't even available in Western countries. So if you wanted to play it up until then, you had to play on Japanese servers. And also, Phantasy Star Online 2 references Phantasy Star Universe and Phantasy Star Online 1. Phantasy Star Online 1 was on the Dreamcast.
Do you not have a Dreamcast lying around? Do you not have phones?
Well, I do, and I've actually got 3 Dreamcasts, but that's beside the point because some of this stuff you can't see unless you have online capability. The servers for Phantasy Star Online 1 was shut down in the early 2000s. However, the fans have gone, we don't like that, and have reverse engineered the code so you can actually play it online. But also, World of Warcraft, up until the launch of the classic servers, because of the fact that the open world itself was completely recreated during the Cataclysm expansion, a lot of those original quests from the original world and the stories that they were telling, including some quests that were really well crafted and well thought of, were gone and were no longer available. So up until the launch of the classic servers, the only way that you could experience that was by watching these kind of quite low-res videos that people had captured of the time.
The interesting thing with video, and I was thinking about this earlier, that it's not the same experience. It's a capture, but there's still context missing in terms of the player's capacity and involvement in that situation. And I still think it's as close as we can get without there just being things magically held in magic places that allow these things to go on
without
forever.
literal time travel.
Yeah. And what you said before there about World of Warcraft also reminds me of Final Fantasy XIV and all the issues around that. Although I guess it's a bit different because no one liked the original Final Fantasy XIV, so I don't really see why anyone would want to play it. But so I don't.
Somebody asked Yoshi P, the game director for Final Fantasy XIV. Somebody said, would you ever think about launching original flavor Final Fantasy XIV on separate servers? And he just went, no, nightmare!
I mean, if you look at the maps to Final Fantasy XIV before the Realm Reborn, Redux, whatever you want to call it, it's a demonstrably bad game. Like, they were not finished making the game when they launched it, and it just looks like it wouldn't have any fun. And I think that's probably what he's talking about, is he would know more than we do whether it was fun, because he's since made a game that everyone loves.
So I was actually going to flip it over to you, Mitch, and ask if you had any direct experience with the kind of loss of content or content gating that we've been talking about so far.
I mean, apart from a similar experience with Destiny 2, trying to get back into that and having the much more specifically annoying situation where I purchased Destiny 2 when it was launched and can no longer do the quests that I spent money on because of the way they've structured the new online experience. It's quite... well, put it this way, I hit a bit of a wall because of RPG mechanics and my general lack of attention span, which meant I never reached the quest where you can get Sparrow, which is the vehicle that allows you to travel very quickly. So my character never had a Sparrow. And I loaded up the game recently after they had made a lot of changes to the way it all works. And not only was I first dumped into some sort of a combat arena that I had absolutely no idea what was going on. I think because it may have been intentional, like a cold open to a TV show. I don't know for sure, but it was very confusing. And then they sent me back to the tower, which is the main hub area, and I couldn't find the lady who used to manage the sparrows. So even if I knew exactly where to go, I'm not sure if the quest where you could get the vehicle to ride around the worlds on, which was the only way you can get from place to place without walking very slowly across these enormous maps. I don't even know if that was available to me. I talked to as many quest people as I could, and it seemed like there were
Because it's
only...
in your ghost now.
Mm.
You
It's
just
so
have
weird.
it. But how
Yeah, well,
would you know that?
I never had it. So yeah, like I actually recalled using one because in Destiny 1 you get a sparrow very early on, and I thought, oh, I must just be pressing the wrong button. That's why I can't get my sparrow in Destiny 2. No, it's still not there because I hadn't completed the quest, but now everything has been rearranged, so I wasn't even sure where to go for that.
Oh my.
Something has just occurred to me, actually. Even if, in the future, we manage to find a way to preserve these games, these online games, so much knowledge about what to do and, the best way, like the best equipment and the best way to complete quests and so on, is stored in community hubs.
Mm.
Things like for World of Warcraft, things like WoWWiki and WoWhead. In the future, if we preserve the games, there's no guarantee that those will be preserved as well.
Well, I think it's so interesting that you point that out because so much of this conversation exists around the fact that it provides context. Like, obviously, the big question kind of towards the end of our discussion will be like, why does it matter? Why should we care? And so much of that is around context. And without those communities, and those communities change, I mean, it's much of the reason why something like Destiny changes, why WoW changes, is because these communities change. The way we play games change, and then the technology we have to support them changes. And so, even though at the time, in fact, a streamer I was listening to yesterday was talking about like Lost Ark coming out and people being really excited. Yay, another MMO starting. Yay, yay, yay. And he just said, y'all could all just jump into WoW Classic tomorrow, but you're not going to because it's a different time that we're in now. Those MMOs aren't going to give you that same feeling because you, like the original MMOs, it was such a mind-blowing experience to connect with people online, whereas now it's all we do. We can get that in so many different ways. And so that context is already lost, but we're still chasing that same feeling. And it's so strange to think about it in that way because, yeah, exactly right. If the communities around it, they might still exist, but even if it's the same group of people, their thoughts and their experiences have changed in the 5, 10, 20, 30, 40 years since that information was current. And therein makes it so murky and hard to even, find a solution within any of that.
I would be interested then to know, what do you think is the difference between changes in communities for online games and changes in communities for any other sort of a big brand style or franchise for television, movies, comic books, in the way that MMOs present? Because I'm thinking, we talk about World of Warcraft or Final Fantasy XIV, MMOs of that scale, they're similar to your Marvel Cinematic Universes or Star Wars or DC Comics, where they raise a community that has interests in all sorts of different areas that combine and sort of overlap and crossover in the game. And I'm sure people like it for different reasons, but if you want to get into DC Comics today, not only do they keep refreshing it because they want to get people on board, so And so they're constantly refreshing, so there's always a way to jump in without needing the background context. But if you want the background context, you can still read the old comics. And if anything, the changes in the community of a comic book franchise, they aid the reading of old comics, because now you have all sorts of additional context around them. You can read Batman from the 40s and 50s, knowing the sort of the external pressures that led to those books being written in the first place, which to me seems like a pretty decent trade-off for not being around when those books were published.
It's a really interesting point, and I should frame for anyone that doesn't know that my full-time work is working within communities in video games. So it's a hard one, because I think there's so many different things popping up in my head. One's like, how much of it is a corporate telling you that you'll make more money as a jumping off point? If you say it's issue 1, and then part of me is going, even though a game expansion's like, yeah, it's fresh and we're redoing it, it's going to make the new player experience fun. The reality is people aren't coming into that with the expectation of, oh yeah, this is going to feel great for me. Like, I think in the case of a game, like ongoing live service games, you kind of know that there is still going to be context missing. But in other media forms, we don't do that. Although someone that's more well-versed in, say, Doctor Who or something that's existed for such a long time with different permutations of different doctors and things like that, I'd be curious to hear thoughts there on how something like that progresses through time, just because it's outside of my own knowledge.
I think what we're talking about here is knowledge sharing. And one of the things that MMO communities are very good at is knowledge sharing, which is why you end up with these massive databases of knowledge about the best way to do things and things to do and not to do, and lore and characters and their backstory and how things have changed. The relationship between an MMO community and the developer/publisher is different from the relationship between, say, comic book fans or of fans of Star Wars or whatever it is, because that's kind of a brand giving something to a consumer, whereas with MMO communities, it's kind of more peer-to-peer.
Yes.
You are the content.
Correct.
Absolutely.
And this kind of goes to stuff like Minecraft and so on, where this is a blank canvas. What you do with it is entirely up to you, and the ideas and the inspiration and knowledge on how to do something new comes from members of the community, not from the brand.
And things are intentionally left out. That's the other thing too. Developers leave secrets in the hopes of, we can't wait for someone to find this. I'm really curious to hear how they feel about this particular thing, because it is intentionally left somewhat ambiguous. I can't
Ambiguous.
speak. Ambiguous, thank you. I'm like, I don't know what word I tried to say. Ambiguous, because they want there to be a sense of discovery, because that also then keeps player retention up. It's true. And in some cases, it might hit the mark. Other times, it does exactly what it's meant to do. But in that way, it's that peer-to-peer. It's helping to foster that peer-to-peer. And that's where, we have such different roles that kind of foster that. But it's the same problem. What happens if those forums get shut down? What happens if one day Reddit just turned around and said, yeah, nah, we're cool, we're done? What happens if we just lost all of those logs? Like, what happens then to those communities? Where do they go and what do they do?
We've seen it happen with things like the shutdown, the LiveJournal strike through, when all of these communities were banned in effect for adult content, and they're like, I can't even begin to imagine how much creative content was destroyed during that. So, it's all those things are lost like tears in the rain thing.
But it's
And
such a shame too.
It's art we're talking about. It's people's creative impulses, and for obvious reasons, they weren't getting paid for this. They were just doing it because they loved it.
In terms of since the subject is media preservation, then like not to try and value judge the sorts of entertainment we choose, but earlier on in the podcast, several episodes ago, we were talking about the 500 hours of Dying Light 2 weird little mini tiff that happened on Twitter. And we were talking about how, like, what are those 500 hours? Because, 500 hours where every hour is as excellent as an episode of The Expanse is very different to 500 hours collecting strawberries.
I could go on about all this all day, though. You don't want to start me on this.
Now
you up and set you off.
Now I'm wondering if I should, because my question relates directly to something you mentioned in the Discord, which is we have fans now creating preferred pathways through the early game so that new players have a decent idea of where to go and what to do and how to build their characters in all sorts of categories that are not in the game they're playing. They're all fan created content on wikis and such, where it's like, oh, if you would like to have an easy time getting to level whichever, follow this path and gain these abilities and do these quests first. Which to me is maybe, if we talk about something like Doctor Who or in my situation Star Trek, it's similar to saying, oh, so you want to get into this thing that you think you might like, start with a couple episodes from season 1 and 2 of the Next Generation that are actually good, and then skip the rest and then watch from season 3 on or something. But the difference being, it's easy for me to say, skip these episodes and then just watch the rest of the show. It's a lot more complicated to have entire wikis describing this is how you actually get interested in the game, and all of that sort of comes under how are we talking about enjoying these games? I mean, there is no value to art specifically, but there could be a value to how we choose to spend the time we play games in. And for some people, the MMO experience is 100% exactly what they want to do. But you don't know if you're that sort of person unless you give it a shot. And if most games aren't onboarding people as in the same friendly way as, say, a new show of Star Trek will start with a bang and get exciting and introduce some cool characters, then it's going to have a harder time hooking the people who are on the edge and maybe aren't sure if they're into an MMO or not.
I'd like to go back. We were talking earlier on the, I think it was last night on the Discord, about the Dot Hack franchise. The first 4 games are very difficult to get hold of, particularly the last 2 of that set of 4.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you get someone into a franchise when part of that franchise no longer exists? I mean, Doctor Who fans are really lucky that an Unearthly Child exists. It could very easily have been one of the ones that got deleted.
And I think there is something here about how capitalism sees art, which is as this sort of this transaction, because we've talked about games as a service, MMO style video games, and television programs. 2 of the storytelling media, I might say, are viewed in sort of the executive sphere as the most flimsy, because they're happy to just wipe things away and keep going as long as they've got people on the hook. Recently, there's been a series on Disney Plus called The Book of Boba Fett, however you want to pronounce it, in the Star Wars universe. And it, like the previous 2 live-action shows they've done, has such a feeling of immediacy, because these are kind of big, flashy, almost event-style episodes that don't do much but show a bunch of things people recognize so that they can get excited that they recognize it each week for the social media to then discuss and then move on with the following episode. And the previous shows that they've done in the Star Wars universe, I don't think anyone has discussed them beyond the button at the end of each season where they reveal something or they show off something extra exciting and Leonardo DiCaprio pointing at the TV. I recognize that sort of a meme. It's television as it was for so very long, which is just chucked away. It's there, it's on television while it's being broadcast, the week it's on, for people to discuss, and then they move on to the next one. And I don't think they expect that people are going to come back and rewatch these.
But it's because it's changed so much. Once upon a time, you had a limited number of stations. You had a limited range of options available to you. So you had to draw that shit out. You had to say, okay, now everyone, you have to talk about this one thing. But it's because there was nothing else to talk about. So I don't necessarily think it's wrong to design it in that way. I think it's an unfortunate pitfall that we find ourselves in just because of the streaming era, where we now have every single thing at our fingertips and we can just go for gold with whatever excites us in the moment. Like I've been diving into Taskmaster UK for whatever reason. I just chucked it on one day and now I haven't stopped because I think it's hilarious. But at the end of the day, am I going to be talking about that in months or years? Maybe, because I thought it was really cool and funny and it's a clever concept. But am I going to be talking about Hawkeye? Maybe not. Did I enjoy it? Yes. But I have other things to move my attention onto. And so I think as a whole, and it's really important to remember that this is right now. And the only way we can do this is by preserving our media, by taking note of this and saying, this is the world we live in right now. This is the way we consume media. It's very different to what it was 10 years ago and 20 years ago. It's a very different world for us. And so it now, at least in my opinion, one of the most important things is going, what are the things that shine through to us personally? Less as a whole, but more, okay, what are the few franchises or mediums that really stick out to me and matter? And that's how we've then been building communities around them, because it's not like everyone in your hometown is watching the finale to Cheers or something like that. We're all watching our own different things based on our interests, and it's putting us into these little pigeonholes. And we're building communities around that instead of just kind of being forced to enjoy the one thing. So I think it's a good thing in a way, but it's important to recognize it and actually make note that this is how it happens right now.
Amy, you just mentioned things that matter. And one thing we're trying to do is sort of break things up a little bit with what do we vibe and segment. So, and hopefully this doesn't spin out into another 15-minute mini episode like last week's did.
It won't. I can be brief.
Lies.
I can be. What am I vibing? I vibe lots of things. I'm 100% back on my Horizon Zero Dawn train. Things that matter. That to me is something that has my whole heart. And funnily enough, actually makes a point about preserving knowledge and information. And I just find it really funny that that's something that gets touched on in that game. Because I'm very, very excited for the next one coming out. I see anything about it, I just start crying. I can't, it's involuntary. I just start crying because I'm just so excited. Otherwise, I've been playing a heckload of Path of Exile because a new expansion came out and it's really, really good and I love it.
Yes, thank you for that new addiction.
I'm so sorry. Like, I'm not, but
No,
I
you're
am.
not. No, you're not.
It's funny because my partner was the one that got me into it originally. I said, could we maybe try this game? He's like, oh, I love it. No one ever wants to play it with me though. And then we were like 500 hours later, a couple months into that. And I was like, I've never done this to a game before. I had always been a single player person. And then to have come out of the end of that experience, I was like, wow, I never expected that from myself. And I think that's really cool. And it touches on something you mentioned before, Mitchell, was like that 500-hour thing. Where does that come from? And where are you finding the value in that? It looks so different for everyone. Like before, I was the type of person that was like, yeah, I 100%ed Assassin's Creed Valhalla, which I did do, by the way. Like I love doing that. I'm like, yeah, I've got hundreds of hours, like 100 hours in this one game. And I was always really proud of that. And I was like, what is end game? I don't understand. Why would I continue playing a game past that point beyond the story, the only thing that matters in video games? And then I discovered this whole new thing that I didn't know about. And I just think that's really, really cool that there are so many different things available to us in different games that we can find those experiences and just enjoy them like that. That's it. That's what I'm vibing. I told you I can be very succinct.
All right. So, and before the intermission, we were talking a little bit about streaming services because of Mitchell. You brought up the Book of Boba Fett, and that's something that I'm particularly interested in because, well, in the context of media preservation, because it's not like streaming services aren't. They're obviously not a physical media, and I'm sure that some of them release their content on DVD, Blu-ray, whatever. But fundamentally, there's not that same like physical sense of preservation in the content that's being produced. And I guess to some degree it's the same in games because, a lot of games don't actually get a physical release. So I'm wondering if like the rise of streaming services and digital distribution sort of changes the way that media preservation works.
Can I make a point before I forget it? Because you talking
Absolutely.
about that now has just reminded me of something. So at the start of this episode, we're talking about media preservation and things. And as absurd as it is, the only thing that sticks around is oral recountings of stories. They are what exist. Because, sure, we still quote Shakespeare and his works are still performed to this day. And we can see paper, but how much of that was because orally it kept going on? How many other playwrights existed around the same time that works were burned or got lost? Or like there's just so many different things when you think about painting can rub off depending on the tool that was used, or paper can burn. But our oral histories live on no matter what. They're going to change. And that in and of itself has so many other problems. But our computers could all just go up in smoke one day and we'd all be in the same situation. At the end of the day, we have to keep talking to each other. We have to keep telling stories and sharing these stories. Otherwise, nothing gets preserved. And by the same token, I'm going to use Shakespeare as an example just because I have it on the mind at the moment. But, if someone hadn't said, back in the whatever hundreds, saw a really great play last night, you should go see it. If there hadn't been that continuation of, this really captured my feeling about gender and power at the time, it wouldn't still be being done and we wouldn't still know what it is. It's only through people saying, you know what, that was really powerful. Or, hey, that game really made me think. Or that TV show just made me feel everything. Without those things don't get saved. So it is really important that we just keep talking about them.
It's something I wanted to bring up actually. Because people like talk about like streaming services and the fact that you could just turn servers off. So it's better to have a physical copy, Blu-ray, DVD, whatever it is. And then you find out about things like bit rot and disk rot.
Mm.
For those not aware, disk rot is where the layers of a CD start to delaminate from each other. And at this point, the CD becomes completely unusable. People who collect the Sega Mega CD have been experiencing this already. Cartridges have electronic components in them. Electronic components can fail, they can rust, the contacts can corrode. I mean, we don't know exactly how Blu-rays are going to be affected in the future, but I suspect the same problem with disc delamination is going to be an issue. Any kind of magnetic storage, if you get it near a magnet, bye. Or a strong enough electricity source. Put it on top of a speaker, as somebody I knew in school once did. And all of these are problems. And the thing that I kind of find a bit baffling about how many of the large companies deal with this. I mean, Nintendo were a great example of this. So they keep taking down the ROM sites. So they're saying like you can't download this ROM of Earthbound or Mother 3 or Star Fox or whatever it is. To which my response is, okay, cool. I can't
Then give
download it
us an
illegally.
option.
Can I buy it, please? No. Why are you making it so hard for me to give you money?
It's really interesting though, because from a technical perspective, some of those things are so much harder to pull off than they seem. A story went around on Twitter like a week or two ago. I cried. It was beautiful. Sean Murray that made
No Man's
Hello
Sky.
Games. Yeah. So their first kind of mobile game that was a big success was something called Joe Danger. And there was a story that went around of them maybe a week or two ago re-released the game because someone contacted them out of nowhere with the most beautiful heartfelt email about their son, that this game really mattered to them and that child really needed it. But all of a sudden, iOS didn't support that game anymore. And that became a problem. And in the email, he says, rather casually, they tell us to just email the developer as if that's a thing that can just be done. And I can't imagine this is easy for you at all, or might not even be feasible, but I thought I'd try anyway. And they literally had to like rebuild it for it to work on however iOS's backend now works. And it's just astounding to think how many cases of that we might have with hardware and more consoles. PC and things is probably a lot easier because even though things have changed, I imagine structurally and things, I'm not that technically minded.
With PC, it's always possible to set up a virtual machine, so even old software can usually be convinced to work on modern hardware.
Yeah, so it's just really fascinating to think, even though you might really, like, I am sure Nintendo would love to, but there has to be a reason. And maybe it's because things weren't preserved and some of that knowledge is now gone, or people that worked on those games that owned property of, or like intellectual property of the code, or any number of things could be happening there that prevent certain things from happening.
There was an interesting one with the re-release of the Kingdom Hearts series. Most of the assets for the original Kingdom Hearts game, Kingdom Hearts 1, still existed. But the kind of final code base didn't. I don't know if it's true, but somebody said that it might have been damaged during the earthquake. So when those machines were damaged during the earthquake, that code, the kind of the final version of the code was damaged or lost. What they ended up doing was, because they still had all of the kind of various assets and voice lines and things like that available, was they took all of those and they imported them into the Kingdom Hearts 2 engine, which still existed and was fine.
It's incredible, hey?
Yeah,
the
it's amazing.
workarounds needed.
But people have to care.
So I have a question based on both those points, which maybe I don't know, Damien. It probably ties into our conversation last week, but there's a historical political angle to this that I worry about the most, which is everything you said about us needing to keep telling stories. I think is a fantastic way to look at this, because it's like in 20 years' time, people won't care really if they can't watch like half the episodes of the Book of Boba Fett, because
I mean,
because
there'll be one angry person shaking their fist at the air going, give me
Sure.
more Star Wars.
Sure, absolutely. There are always Star Wars fans. That's true. But I like unless there's an actually interesting story, like for example, this has happened with movies. But say there's like a behind the scenes story that's a real human interest story, like with the Joe Danger game, that comes out around the Book of Boba Fett, and we start telling it. It spreads across the world, and there's a reason for us to hang on to it. 20 years from now, maybe there'll be people trying to preserve it, but just any sort of mid-range streaming show that is meant for weekly conversation and then moves on. If people aren't talking about it, it disappears. But everything matters to somebody, including our weirdo Star Wars fan, and there's a conversation about preservation that has to do with who we let tell the narrative of the history of a medium, because when we let things like the Square Enix remaking Kingdom Hearts in the Kingdom Hearts 2 engine just to be able to sell it again, when that sort of situation is the only way a lost game gets rebuilt and sold and allowed to be viewed again by a new generation, that means that the only reason these games get preserved at all is because of money. So Kingdom Hearts gets rebuilt in a new engine so people can play it again, but Chrono Cross still hasn't made it to Australia in any form. You know,
having worked with developers now for well over a year, there is so much passion in those rooms, and so many things get fought for harder than you may ever know. But Joe Random's story might not ever get heard, but what we do hear is that they wanted to remake it instead of someone going, you know, I just think it really sucks that I can't share this thing with my kids. Or we genuinely have no idea. But I completely agree with you, Mitchell, in that it depends who's telling those stories. And I think developer stories in the context of this particular medium matter so much.
It's also how things are. What are you talking about? Things like who is telling the story and who controls what is being released or re-released or whatever it is, and things that can be changed and edited. The thing that worries me is that how much things by deciding what is and what isn't preserved, the things that will be prioritized are things that are
mainstream,
preserving status quo. Yeah, mainstream, preserving status quo.
Saleable.
Telling, yeah. I was going to use a very, very brief example.
Please do.
The redub by Netflix of Neon Genesis Evangelion. One particular scene towards the end of the series where a male character says to another male character, "I love you," in the original dub, now says, "I like you." It's one word.
Mm-hmm.
But to so many members of the audience who are not heterosexual, that meant a lot, because that kind of says, I am in this. This represents me. This talks to me. After that change, it doesn't anymore. Who has the right to make that choice to say, yeah, this isn't for you?
And
yeah. It's always those like marginalized stories that are swept out of history.
Well, a really embarrassing one I heard is that it's not even minority, because it's 50-50, well, or close to 50-50 of the population, there are people working today in games who were inspired by Barbie. Fashion games, games about subjects that people considered only for girls, because they were marketed only as girls' games. Games that no one preserves. No one is bothering to go back to the Game Boy Advance and pick up all these games that sold very well because they were based on an IP like Barbie. And so lots of people played them and got into video games by enjoying them. Doesn't matter whether the games were any good or not. They're part of their story. And so for those people, it's important that they can tell that story.
But why should the fact that it is or isn't mainstream, why should that be the yardstick by which we measure whether or not it deserves to be preserved?
And whether or not the change is some sort of an important change or a tiny change, like it almost doesn't matter.
I mean, for example, if the first interracial kiss on television, which was on Star Trek in America, what if that had been changed, cut, wiped? Would we be saying that doesn't make that much of a difference? I think it'd make a huge fucking difference.
It ties into media preservation because whether you're changing the meaning of a scene or removing an entire show from the historical record by making it inaccessible, we're talking about a narrative that the historians tell, or that we as the people who enjoy media and share it with one another, the story that we would like to tell of the humans behind the things that we consume. It needs that context, and if you don't have primary sources, it doesn't have the same impact or interest. So for a lot of reasons, I mean, this is why I brought up the Barbie game thing. It's like there are lots of GBA games that would not be preserved for any company reason, and probably wouldn't be preserved by 99% of the people who are interested in making the kinds of games that people who play GBA style games buy now, even. But we're lucky that the ROMs have been saved. That the ROMs of these games are available, maybe pseudo legally on the internet. But if they had not been ripped from those cartridges and they were just left to sort of molder, you wouldn't have the history of hundreds of games that people had played and had gotten them into video games in the first place.
The Barnyard game on PS2 to this day is what I claim is the reason I like RPGs. The Barnyard game on PlayStation 2.
There you go.
I'm going to wear that till the cows come home, because quite literally that's what it was about. That game genuinely used RPG mechanics in an interesting, different way that I had never seen before, and it blew my little 13-year-old mind, or whatever it was. And now I love RPGs, and I would never not play them because I think they're the best thing ever. And it's because of probably not the best just movie game, and I think they're so important. But I'm one person against the world whose early experiences were I just bought any crappy knockoff game that they would hawk with movie releases. I loved it. I loved it as well because back in the day, they would release different versions for different consoles. So the Shark Tale game on PC was different to the Shark Tale game on PlayStation. The Sims on PlayStation Portable was different to the Sims on PC. They were different games, and I think that's so fascinating, and I love it, and it's really important. But I'm going to have to yell that story from the rooftops because who else is sharing it? It's my random little story.
Something has just occurred to me, actually. It's all of those tiny developers who were doing things like Game Boy Advance games, Game Boy Color games, going back several years, things like the Game Gear and so on. And how many of them went bust? And how many of those code bases were chucked in a skip somewhere? And I have just made myself sad.
It is so sad. Because also, these are people who were probably burnt out on an early crappy industry, who haven't talked to anybody for the preservation of oral history. So, they're just oh, I made games for the Game Boy. It was a stressful, annoying time, and all we turned out was shit, and that's about it. I'm sure there's a lot more to it than that, but they probably aren't telling people.
You've just
Because
made it my personal mission to now go on Twitter until I find the person that was the creative lead on that Barnyard game. I'm going to make that my personal mission. I'm going to make something about this. I'm going to find that fucker. I'm going to find them.
You find him and you bring him on this podcast.
Absolutely.
I'm going to find them. I'm making it my personal mission. I'm going to find them.
That's the important part, because it's the people that matter.
I think that's a good place to end it, actually.
All right. Well, I do want to start wrapping up. So just really quickly, last couple of topics. So last week, Mitchell and I discussed the whole Spotify Joe Rogan thing. Since then, Spotify's gone and removed a whole bunch of episodes of his podcast from their platform. And with all the dilemma facing Facebook this week, I just wanted to ask, like, does this same idea of media preservation extend to those platforms where it's sort of like more user-generated content? Should that all be preserved as well, or is there a hierarchy of importance there?
Can you imagine in 1500 years' time, when aliens discover the ruins of human civilization, how much happier they would be to even have a couple hours of some bad podcast to give them context on what a certain person or persons were like at the time we were alive today? Like,
it's all very well preserving, like, newspapers and important historical books and Oscar-winning movies and all that sort of business. But I'm going to give you an ancient historical example here. So we know an awful lot about the Egyptian pharaohs and nobility. What we don't know a huge amount about is the common people in Egypt. Because a lot of their stuff wasn't preserved. The pharaohs had these massive tombs with all these artifacts and walls caked in words about their deeds, which were mostly lies, but we're never mind. And then they found, near the temple at Deir el-Bahri, a village where the workers who worked on the tombs in the Valley of the Kings and Queens lived. So all of these workmen who lived there and like made this stuff, and they found this village, and all of the Egyptologists were over the moon with excitement.
Yeah.
Because this is just ordinary people stuff. There's like a thing written on the wall about, this foreman who's a complete dick and doesn't pay them on time. And it's just people being people. And that's so important as to understand who they were as people, not as figures, not as celebrities and personas, as actual like regular people who complain about that guy who's a dick, and my food is cold, and it's been so hot today, and all this sort of ordinary day-to-day stuff. So yeah, it's important to preserve it because that's us as people, as we are now. I mean, a lot of it's crap.
90% of everything.
Garbage. Yeah.
Yeah. Share your shit.
Still important.
Absolutely.
Yes. All right, so we're in agreement on that one. So then the last point is, as you mentioned earlier, I think, Amy, why does this all matter? Like, why does it matter if some Yahoo managed to drag up a 50-year-old episode of Doctor Who and say, oh, look, well, we all thought this was lost. Why does it matter?
There are so many reasons why it matters, but one of the most important being context, because we can make all the assumptions we want about a world and a people's. But if you don't have the context within which it's created, you have a problem. If all of, for like just a random example, if Twitch went down like Mixer did tomorrow, and then 20 years from now they were trying to discuss what on earth, they pulled all the logs from Twitter and tried to unpack what that discourse meant and how people's livelihoods were impacted, or how people lost communities, or couldn't connect with people that they'd been good friends with in a chat or whatever. Without the context of those videos, you have no idea what that means or why any of that mattered. And I think for that reason, it's really important. But I think the most important reason is because people matter and stories matter. I told myself a very long time ago, this is me personally, no matter what I did in life, I just wanted to tell stories. I just wanted to share stories and be involved with as many as I could, because it's so important. It's who we are. It's how we go around. It's how we get by from day to day. And whether it's a 50-year-old episode of Doctor Who or something, it's the fact that that matters and that sparks something in someone. And if we don't preserve that, that's a problem. We create art out of love and passion and because we want to tell stories about each other and about our experiences, whether that's through visual or not. I'm privileged every day that I get to see people's incredible fan art or their rants about something they hate in a game, or like I get to see all of that, and it is a privilege every day. Like I was watching reaction videos all day today and I just couldn't help but smile and get tears in my eyes because I'm like, this matters. It matters. And if we don't preserve that and hold on to it, even to be purely selfish about it, we'll lose so many beautiful memories of our past. And what a shame that is. And so that's why we should care, because even if it only matters to one person, it might have changed someone's whole life. It might have meant everything to them. And so, yeah, we should preserve as much as we possibly can.
Agreed.
Agreed.
Yeah. So if there's any final thoughts at all about anything we've discussed?
I think we've covered everything fairly comprehensively. This has been a bit the Amy and Rebecca soapbox show, but
That's
I think that's
totally okay.
I got no problem with that.
You two haven't been around, so it's absolutely your turn.
Yes, but I have trouble getting off once I hop on that train. So feel free to throw me off at any time and pick me up at a later stop. That's fine.
Oh, no, thank you so much. Yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure having everyone here together. Unfortunately, Mike will not be joining us again for the foreseeable future, but hopefully he can come back. So it'll just be the four of us, and hopefully we can get together a bit more regularly. One way or another, we'll see you next week.